In this video, we'll be discussing about directory harvesting attack. Directory harvesting attack, also known as DHA, is a type of a brute force attack where the goal is to gain a list of active email addresses in a domain. With this, an attacker can utilize three SMTP commands, namely EXPN, VRFY, and RCPT. EXPN and VRFY are designed for email address verification. As you can see from the screenshot, I've tried to use the EXPN command, but the SMTP server replied that it is not recognized. This should be fine because this command is actually obsolete. On the other hand, I've tried to use the VRFY command, but the SMTP server replied that it is disabled, which is very common nowadays for a secured messaging system. Now, for the last resort, an attacker can use a command which cannot be disabled, the RCPT. Unlike the other two, RCPT is not designed for email address verification. In fact, this command is required for a complete SMTP transaction. We can see from the screenshot two different possible results. One, it can tell you that the recipient address is rejected if the SMTP server didn't find any equivalent mailbox or the address is not listed in a lookup table. Two, it will say 250 OK. That's if the mailbox or the recipient address exists in a lookup table. With these different responses, an attacker can have a list of the active email addresses in a domain. In postfix, the response is controlled by a parameter called SMTPD recipient restrictions. By default, the parameter will make the SMTP server to reply 250 OK to all email addresses. That's as long as it is under the specified domain. On the other hand, if a lookup table was explicitly defined, as depicted on this example, showing the lookup as the LDAP server, each RCPT command will have an equivalent query on it. To reiterate, let's say we have an SMTP server, or in this case, it could be an attacker and the server. Let's assume the default configuration for SMTPD recipient restrictions parameter. An attacker will start the TCP handshake with SYN, the server will SYNACK, then the client will acknowledge. After that, SMTP protocol starts. The server will post 220 greetings. The attacker will say, "Hello, my name is SMTP client." The server will say, 250, "Okay, here's my fully qualified domain name." Then the attacker will initiate mail from saying that, "Hey, I got this email from user@example.com." And the server will respond 250 OK. The attacker will then send RCPT2. It's like saying that this email is for administrator@targetdomain.com. Without checking from anyone, the server will say 250 OK. In fact, it will always respond the same thing as long as the email is under its supported domain. Now, since the attacker already got what he needs, it will send TCP FIN to the server without finishing their SMTP conversation. So in this case, there is actually no message that has been transferred. After that, the attacker will start a new conversation, but of course with different recipient. This will happen on and on until all email addresses on the initial list are all queried, completing the attack. So the takeaway is that if the SMTPD recipient restrictions parameter is configured as default, the server will always say OK to any email address under its supported domain. Moving forward, given the lookup table for the parameter is explicitly defined, there will be some changes during the communication. Of course, we'll still have the attacker, the SMTP server, but this time we have a lookup server, which is an AD server. So TCP handshake will start, and then the SMTP greetings, and then we have the mail from until the RCPT2. When the server receives this command, it will tap the holder of the lookup table via LDAP search request. It's like saying, do administrator@targetdomain.com listed? Then the lookup server could respond, yes, I know him, or on this example, let's say I don't know him. By that time, SMTP server will get back to the attacker saying the 554 recipient address rejected. Then the attacker will terminate the session again. This cycle will repeat until all email addresses on the initial list are queried, completing the attack. But this time, the attacker can have two different responses, making it a successful DHA attack. Given that, is there any option for us to avoid such kind of attack? Of course, there is. And the most obvious one is that configure the SMTP recipient restrictions parameter as default. That is, not giving any idea on the attacker which are active and which are inactive email addresses. But the question is that, how about the NDR? Some might argue that this configuration will introduce another issue, which is an email backscatter. That is true, but the goal here is not to give the attacker an easy way to successfully do the DHA. And actually, there is separate protection on your email gateway that can mitigate it, which I will be discussing in a separate video.